Anger and grief after the genocide trial of Guatemala's former US-backed dictator is suspended. What's at stake in the prosecution of Efrain Rios Montt? Plus, after this week's deadly explosion at a fertilizer plant in Texas, we ask if sufficient regulations are in place to protect workers' lives. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rattansi. Just days before a criminal court was due to issue a verdict in the genocide trial of former Guatemalan dictator Rios Montt, an appeals court halted all proceedings. Rios Montt is accused of presiding over the killing of more than 1,700 Mayans in the Ixil region after taking power in a US-backed military coup in 1982. That period is known as the darkest in the country's 36-year civil war. Entire villages were wiped out by state security forces. Homes were burnt down with people still inside. 29,000 were forcibly displaced and subject to the brutality of the armed forces. Rios Montt's lawyers say that he bears no responsibility and that there's no legal basis for the charges. For the survivors, the trial was supposed to be a step forward in helping the country confront its past. Rachel Levin has more from Guatemala City.
We're outside the Constitutional Court in downtown Guatemala City, where many of the victims in this case have gathered. And what they're hoping is to hear from this court in a matter of the next 24 hours that the court will allow the proceedings to continue. This case is being closely monitored by the international community, by human rights groups such as Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and the United Nations. And what they're saying is that this case is really a test of the Guatemalan judicial system. Now, many people here in Guatemala have always accused the justice system of being corrupt. So in some ways, this is really a test to see if it can actually try someone as high profile as the former general and be able to deliver a clean trial with a verdict that many people here will be able to accept. Now, while this case is being closely monitored by the international community, here in Guatemala, it's had a mixed reaction. There are areas of this country where people don't even know that the trial is taking place. And that's because Guatemala is one of the poorest countries in Latin America. Many people don't have access to the media, to television, to radio, or even to newspapers. So while it's something that is gripping people on the outside, here in Guatemala, it's having a bit of a mixed reaction. There are people who do support the general and who actually are against the idea of these trials taking place. What they say is that this will only succeed in bringing up bad feelings about the past, that it could destabilize the country, and that it's best really to leave the past alone. But obviously for the victims, for the many men and women and their supporters that are gathered here behind me, they are against that idea. And what they say is that if Guatemala doesn't deal with its past, it really won't be able to have a better future.
For more on this case, we're joined by Kathryn Johnson, the Development and Advocacy Coordinator for the Guatemala Human Rights Commission, USA. And from New York, we have Paul Seils. He's the Vice President and General Counsel at the International Center for Transitional Justice. Paul Seils, first of all, though, in many ways, it's quite remarkable this trial has got this far, given all the obstacles that we're now seeing in daylight again. I mean, how did we get to this point?
No, you're absolutely right. It's a minor miracle in many ways to get to the point of the trial where we are. It's been a very long struggle against the odds. Essentially, it's only been possible because of the courage and the dedication of victims and their representatives over the last 15 years to try and bring this case together, very much without the support for a long time of the prosecution authorities. That changed in recent years with the appointment of the current Attorney General, Claudia Paz, who comes from a human rights background herself and has shown a great deal of courage and dedication to bring the case forward. As I say, that has been as a result of a long story of threats and intimidation against the victims themselves. And the judges who have now been responsible for the trial have also shown great courage. But throughout that process, there have been setback after setback. The continual abuse of technicalities and procedural issues and formalities by the defence and by those who didn't want to see this case ever see the light of day, and by those who basically want to see Guatemala continue to hide the darkest parts of its past.
Well, talk us through this latest judgment, Paul, then. I mean, because it is a bit complicated. It's an appeals court that's made this ruling, not the actual court that's trying Rios Montt.
Well, what's happened here, and it is very technical and rather wrapped up in a whole series of complications, but essentially the appeals court has ruled in relation to an issue that was brought over 2 years ago. When the case started out, it was before, if you like, a pre-trial judge who was dealing with the initial procedures around the case. There was a suggestion that that judge should be dismissed from the case, and there was an appeal against that case. There was never a decision on that case for over 2 years, and the case was then put to another judge who dealt with the case, and it went through the procedures and came up with the trial that we are now seeing. And out of the blue, 2.5 years after that initial issue, the appeals court has all of a sudden decided that it's right and proper to decide on that issue that they had done nothing about for over 2 years. There doesn't seem to be anything wrong with the way in which the issue was passed over to another judge given the earlier decisions. It looks very, very clear to, frankly, anyone with eyes in their head what is going on. It's an attempt to stop the process at this incredibly late stage on the most narrow and probably almost certainly unfounded technicality that has to do with something that almost certainly should have been dealt with 2 years ago.
Yeah, but so what do we make of the timing then? Was there any particular testimony that was coming up, or was there any? I mean, why now? And because I mean, surely they could have done this if they didn't want this trial. This could have been stopped ages ago.
Yeah, this is the amazing thing about it, and this is one of the most interesting issues. Guatemala, as you said in your introduction, is a country where the judicial, and not only the judicial, but the political and legislative areas of the country have been accused of incredible corruption over the years. The judiciary and the prosecution services, I think, actually stand out as one of the more positive issues in the country. There have been improvements and there have been good decisions coming out in recent years, but there is incredible pressure from the outside, from the political elites who stand to lose in all of this. The decision and why it happened at this time, it happened at this time, I think, because they finally got their act together in terms of understanding how serious it was going to be to have almost certainly a conviction for genocide or crimes against humanity against the former dictator. I think they realised that very late in the game. Why it took them so long to realise that, it's not very clear, but it seems clear that they decided to try and put an end to this before a verdict was issued.
Well, I mean, Kathryn, it hasn't escaped many people's notice, though, that one of those for whom there may be great consequences of this trial is the current president of Guatemala, Otto Perez Molina. I mean, is there any evidence to suggest that the government has any hand in all of this?
I don't know that there's direct evidence, although he did come out with a public statement that he agreed with a press release, or it was actually a paid advertisement that came out a couple of days ago in a Guatemalan publication, saying that this process in general was a threat to reconciliation in the country and a threat to national stability. And so he's certainly shown his displeasure with the process and been very public about stating that he doesn't believe that genocide was committed in the country.
What was his role in all of this?
He was a major in the Ixil Triangle, the area where the atrocities were committed at the time that the massacres and genocide was allegedly committed. There is extensive evidence, including video of him in the area, and actually one witness in the trial claimed, who was a mechanic at the time for the military, claimed that he witnessed Otto Perez Molina, who was at that time called Major Tito, ordering massacres and the looting and burning of villages.
What do you think, Paul? Do you think that Otto Perez Molina has a hand in this?
I think it's a part of the story, but I honestly don't think it's the major part of the story. I think Otto Perez Molina, as you said earlier on, if you look at what he's done over the last 3 or 4 months, there's 2 or 3 things to look at. Otto Perez has been careful to appear to respect the separation of powers. He's actually been surprisingly supportive of the Attorney General in general about her work and defending her in what she's been doing, not only in this trial but in relation to attacks on drug trafficking, etc. He's not been intervening in a way that previous presidents might have done. He has done it now, and I don't think it's necessarily because he feels directly threatened. I think it's to do with a bigger picture. I think it's to do with the picture that finally, as I say, there has been much more pressure. It's more related to the fact of these other parties going into detail about the threat to the peace process. We have to be very clear what that's about. That's not a serious allegation that this trial could lead to left-wing guerrillas reforming. That's actually a threat to those pursuing justice and a threat from the political elite saying to them, if you push us too far, we will go back to intimidation and disappearances. That's what that threat's about. That's what they mean when they say this is a threat to the peace process. It's not in any sense a serious suggestion that we'll return to civil war. It's a threat to return to human rights abuses. And Otto Perez is associating himself with that kind of language. I don't think he really seriously thinks that he would ever allow a trial to begin against him directly. And it's part of a bigger picture and a bigger threat rather than a direct threat to him in terms of a prosecution, as far as I can see.
Kathryn, you gave us a sense of some of the allegations against the president. Give us a sense of some of the other testimony that we've heard in the course of this case.
Well, over 100 direct victims have testified, and they've testified to absolute horrific cruelty. And a lot of the testimony made it really clear that it was unarmed civilians that were targeted. Often the elderly, children, infants, even unborn children. There was testimony of fetuses being cut out of mothers' stomachs. There were many testimony about infants being killed along with their mothers, people being burned alive. And then what the testimony really demonstrated was a complete lack of any respect for the lives of the Ixil people or their culture, and really clear that it was attacking the entire Ixil culture, community, and way of life.
As someone who studied this, is there any? I mean, when we hear testimony like this, is there any understanding of why such brutality was ordered against the Ixil people?
I think it has to do with the incredible marginalization of the indigenous community in Guatemala, that at that time, and still now, by many Guatemalans, they're not really seen as fully human. They're seen as a sort of lower form of life. And that marginalization, I think, was shown in the cruelty. However, it was also a deliberate tactic to sow fear and to ensure that, that fewer people would join the guerrilla movements, or would in any way oppose the sort of neoliberal economic order that the government was trying to impose at the time.
And attacks on the Ixil and other indigenous communities, of course, do continue today.
They do, certainly. And in fact, over the last couple of months, we've seen an increase in attacks against indigenous activists, against union leaders, and against land rights and natural resource activists. We've seen various people murdered. We've seen people jailed on spurious charges, and incredible and constant threats against these types of activists.
And just to bring things up to date a bit more than Paul, the other major plank of this is the US's involvement and the US backing with weapons and even military advice to the units that were carrying out these sorts of actions. Are we getting a better picture of that? And of course, although they're having some attempt at accountability in Guatemala, has there been any sort of attempt at accountability for those Reagan administration officials who are still flying pretty high, last I checked, in Washington and elsewhere?
Can I say just three things? In addition to the testimonies from the victims themselves, there is also direct testimony now that explains what Rios Montt knew about what was going on. This is very important to understand. There were military plans, a plan called Plan Sofia, that details exactly who was to report to whom about what. There is a thing called the Plan Ixil, which describes the way in which the people of the Ixil area were understood to be basically these intransigent indigenous rebels from generation to generation. And the plans show exactly who knew what was being done and how that was being reported. And the defence experts themselves for the military, for Rios Montt, came in and said, yes, this system of communication worked. He knew what was happening. So there's not any doubt, in all honesty, about who knew what was happening. To come to the question of the US involvement, has there been any accountability for that? Two things. There was a Truth Commission, as you know, the Commission for Historical Clarification that did report at the end of the 1990s and indicated very clearly the US's role not only in the 1950s when it overthrew the democratically elected government, but also throughout the conflict and the support that was given by various US governments. Bill Clinton did go to Guatemala and apologise for the US role in the coup and in terms of some of the support that was offered through that. So in terms of some degree of at least acknowledgement, if not accountability, there has been a modicum of that. In terms of any criminal investigation for the support given to to Guatemalan authorities throughout that conflict, no. There have been various decisions from the Inter-American Court that have implicated US military advisors in a number of cases of torture and of executions. But in terms of actually a serious accounting of the US involvement, no, there's not been very much of that. I think the one thing we should say to this, though, that of course the US was instrumental in creating the political context for this to happen, but at the end of the day it was Rios Montt and his troops that carried out the genocide.
Is this over then? I mean, what happens next? We've only got 20 seconds left, Paul. From your understanding, though, can this court case continue?
I think in any normal jurisdiction what would happen would be the Constitutional Court would say, let the trial finish, and if there is to be an appeal on the issue of the jurisdiction, let there be an appeal, but finish the trial. Whether or not the Constitutional Court is subject to threats and bribery at this point, we'll have to wait and see.
Paul Seils, thank you very much. Kathryn Johnson, thank you as well. Now, authorities in Texas say a total of 12 bodies have been recovered after the enormous explosion at a fertilizer plant this week. Hundreds more have been injured. The blast not only destroyed the plant, but also surrounding neighborhoods in the town of West, 30 kilometers north of Waco. As the search and rescue operation continues, serious questions are being raised about safety standards. It's emerged that the plant did not have sprinklers, firewalls or other safety mechanisms installed, mechanisms required for all facilities that handle dangerous substances. John Hendren is near the scene in Texas.
This is as close as you get to West Texas, the center of the town where the fertilizer plant explosion occurred. It is still considered unsafe to go inside that town. As the investigation continues, we are learning more about what exactly happened there. One emergency services vehicle and 3 fire trucks were present at the scene and destroyed. That tells you who exactly was there at the time. They were first responders. 150 houses have been cleared, but dozens remain to be cleared. 50 were destroyed, and that is where survivors may remain. This is still considered a search and rescue mission. The central question at this case is exactly what happened to spark the fire that led to the explosion in this small rural town of 2,800. And questions are beginning to be asked here as to why exactly a plant that had volatile ammonium nitrate inside it was located in the center of a small rural town.
And joining me now is Mike Elk, a Labour reporter for In These Times magazine. Mike, we still have a lot of questions about exactly what happened and what caused this explosion, but we do now have a better idea about the record of this plant and the regulatory scrutiny with which it was placed. I mean, it doesn't look good, does it?
No, it doesn't look good at all. It looks very systematic of what happens in so many workplaces in this country. The number of OSHA inspectors in this country is so low.
Occupational Safety and Health Administration,
yeah,
OSHA, right?
Yeah. Workplace safety inspectors is so low that there are so few workplace safety inspectors in the state of Texas that it would take 98 years for the OSHA to look at every workplace in Texas.
But what's interesting, though, is that this facility was quite open about the lack of safety features it had, lack of blast walls or fire sprinklers and things like that. And indeed it said, well, look, we're not handling flammable materials, even though it was clear they had vast amounts of what could be flammable materials. I mean, can you see how this could how this all fits together?
Well, the science of workplace safety is really about identifying hazards, saying that there is the potential something could happen. They said there was no potential of an explosion, and an explosion did occur. Now, in 2006, they got in trouble with the EPA because they didn't have a good risk management plan. They told the EPA that they were going to put certain things into place, which they did not. At the time of the explosion, the plant did not have sprinklers, fire alarms, shut-off valves, or firewalls to isolate the areas that might blow up if a fire started in a different part of the plant.
The Commission on Environmental Quality, Zach Lovar, said, look, there were no complaints about this plant, so therefore there were no inspections. Is that just basically how it works then?
Yeah, I mean, basically the way OSHA works is that since there's so few inspectors in this country, that OSHA doesn't come into a plant typically unless they get a complaint from a worker. And who's going to complain as a worker unless you're a member of a union? Now, Texas is one of the heaviest non-union states in the country. And it also has the highest number of workers that killed on the job every year and one of the highest rates of death. So it's not a surprise that, you know, workers in a non-union state like Texas don't want to speak up.
But is this just simply negligence, or is this a deliberate policy of deregulation and deunionization, or whatever the term is then?
I think it's both. You know, a lot of companies don't want anybody interfering, whether it's a union or deregulation. You know, I covered the Honeywell lockout for a long time, where there was a lot of issues about mishandling of uranium and leaks of uranium. And part of the reason that, you know, many of the workers felt that Honeywell was locking them out was because they didn't want somebody to buffer them, to push back against the bad stuff they were doing with the uranium that they were holding there.
As we look at the country as a whole, how many are killed in industrial accidents each year? 4,500
are killed each year in industrial accidents. And we only spend, as a nation, $550 million a year on workplace safety. That's half as much as we spend protecting fish and wildlife in this country.
As a result of that vast number of people killed, how many people were prosecuted there?
Since 1970, since the enactment of the Occupational Safety and Health Act, 360,000 people have been killed on the job in accidents. There have been only 84 criminal prosecutions under the Occupational Safety and Health Act. And the reason for that is the maximum penalty if you willfully violate safety laws, and that willful violation of safety laws results in the death of a worker, is $7,000. It costs a company $7,000 to kill a worker on the job. That's a cost of doing business if you can save money. And on top of that, the maximum penalty for an employer who kills a worker on a job as a result of a willful safety violation is 6 months in jail. We saw with the Upper Big Branch mine explosion back in 2010 when 29 miners were killed. In the year leading up to that, they had been cited for 400 different safety violations, 50 of them willful. The company was so knowledgeable of how they were breaking the law that they kept 2 different books of safety problems. One book that they would show to the feds, and one book of safety problems that actually existed so that they knew where they were cutting corners. They were that knowledgeable. It wasn't like they were doing this accidentally. So for many companies, it's a calculated risk. Make some more money, break safety laws, but that's also a game of probability. Eventually, you're going to kill workers if you take that risk. That's just the rule of probability.
I mean, you mentioned Upper Big Branch. That was the other major industrial accident that got a lot of attention. Did anything happen after that? Were there any consequences, at least in regulation and in scrutiny of industrial safety?
A lot of workplace safety advocates were very disappointed with what happened after Upper Big Branch. It was the first time in American history that there's been a mine disaster in the last 40 years, and that there hasn't been any kind of mine safety legislation passed after that. And granted, this happened while the House was still controlled by the Democratic Party. No mine safety legislation in the wake of that disaster.
I mean, clearly what happened in Boston is appalling and terrible, but also clearly more people died in this explosion in West. It doesn't seem to be getting much attention there, even though more people are killed in industrial accidents than in terrorism in general in the US. Do we expect any real discussion now about regulation and workplace safety? Are you detecting any?
Well, certainly we're having one here today, and I'm glad we're having it. But I don't think there's going to be a big discussion, unfortunately. Workplace safety, the problem is that people look at what happened in Boston and they think that was an intentional terroristic attack. People don't look at what happened in West Texas and say that's terrorism. But that's a roll of the dice. That's a rule of probability, and eventually probability catches up to you and it kills workers. And it is terrorism for many of these workers. I was thinking about Upper Big Branch. I was up in West Virginia with the president of the mine workers, Cecil Roberts. And he was telling me about there was a worker who died in the Upper Big Branch mine explosion who wrote a letter to his wife in the event that he died in the mine because he thought he would. And I remember Cecil Roberts saying to me, men shouldn't have to write letters to their wives when they go to work. That's something men do when they go off to war, not when they go to work. So it is very terrorizing for the workers who have to work in these workplaces. And sure, most bosses don't want workers to die on the job. Nobody wants anybody to die. But if that's the cost of doing the business, taking the gamble, they're willing to take that gamble.
Mike Elk, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And that's it from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Share your ideas with us on Twitter. Our handle is AJ Inside Story AM.